Jeff, ready to go? And I welcome you, both the more familiar faces and the new faces. I see a bright smile from you. I didn't say anything yet, but you're smiling already. That's already a good sign. It could only be downhill from here. So I welcome you all. According to Jewish mystical teachings, the existence and every fiber of existence, as we know it, even all of us sitting here right now in this room, are renewed every moment perpetually. It's called the concept of perpetual renewal, which means even though on the surface level the universe seems sometimes inanimate or at times static and repetitive, in truth beneath the surface there's a constant energy flow that is being renewed every given moment. Now this idea goes back thousands of years, and if you said it to anybody a century ago or 2 centuries ago, they'd either think you're a religious fanatic or just out of your mind. In general, since we're in the sports season, and it's always interesting. The word fanatic is really the root word for fan is short for fanatic. I don't know if you know this, and you never hear anybody say religious fans and sports fanatics. Just as an aside. So, as I said, a century or two ago, people would think that something's the matter with you, saying that there is a force and energy that's constantly being renewed beneath the surface. But today, you don't even need to be a person of faith to accept and to know that what we call today the flow of energy called the subatomic particles, quantum mechanics, and the new physics that were especially discovered in the last century, in the 20th century, where it became apparent and very clear that what really makes this universe tick and what makes us tick are invisible forces that we will never see with our eyes, but it's definitely an energy field, and that energy field is constantly alive. So even if you look at a room or look at a space where everything seems inanimate, it's not the case at all. It's completely alive, brimming with energy, and if you know how to tap into it, it actually can create enormous amounts and potent power. So really confirming this mystical teaching that I just mentioned. And the simple lesson, of course, is, and I was referring to the faces, as I said, familiar faces, new faces, that in truth is all of us are being renewed every given moment. So the obvious and basic message of that is that never give up on yourself, that even if a moment ago or yesterday was not such a great day, the fact is that's on the surface level. But if you get beneath the surface, there's always new opportunities. And often we can become our own worst enemies when we give up, when we get resigned, or and then for any reason we feel that things are not working out, is because we get trapped by our habits and by routines. And when you understand that beneath it all, there are unrealized, untapped layers of reservoirs of energy, it really can rejuvenate somebody and give them hope even in trying circumstances. So that's just an aside. So in that context, our goal is to try to cut beneath the surface of material surface layers of existence and try to access some inner strength that we all have. I mean, the bottom line is there's nothing as powerful as knowing that you have the ability to face every possible challenge. And the truth is, Judaism's message is not that life is easy or there's some magic tricks. Life is very difficult. And many of us can testify to that. For some it may be more difficult than others, but life is a challenge. The great blessing that Judaism tells us is not that life is easy, that life is maybe challenging, but for every challenge you're also given strength to deal with the challenge. So if you had that choice, if someone were to ask you, what would you prefer, a life with no challenges and no obstacles, or a life with obstacles and challenges, but with knowing the strength that you can overcome it? So the immature response would be, just give me an easy life, one where I have complete respite and bliss. And remember, you'll also not have any growth, because there's no such thing as growth without challenge. There's no such thing as any type of excellence without pressure. That's the fact. That's the laws of nature. The more the pressure, the more the greatness that is achieved, the greater the pressure that's necessary. But pressure doesn't have to be painful, and pressure doesn't have to be difficult. When you know, as I said, that that you have the strength to deal with every particular challenge. Now, of course, the obvious question is, what about those challenges that seem so overwhelming? Well, first of all, who are we to judge what's overwhelming or not? You see two types of people. Two people who have exactly the same challenges, overwhelming challenges, and one person becomes a greater person from it, and another gets broken. So clearly it's not just about the challenge itself. And then the other way around, you have people who have very few challenges, and still their lives are miserable, and they don't work things out. So it's not always objectively about the particular challenge that we have. Like, we'd all love to be able to say, I just wish I didn't have that burden. But it's much more significant to look at not what burden you have, but what tools you have. And once you can direct yourself, and this requires more maturity, obviously, and not just looking for a quick fix. And once you can focus that way, then you're dealing with really getting to the root of issues instead of the symptoms. So one of the objectives, or maybe the primary objective of this weekly get-together, is to try to dig deeper, each of us, into our own souls, and access perhaps hitherto unknown or unrealized reservoirs of power. And this is for each person in their own particular way. Each of us have our own challenges. Each of us have the issues we deal with, whether it's personal, emotional, psychological. And what I attempt to do is take something from the weekly Torah portion or the time period that we're in, the holiday, and take some type of Jewish concept and universalize it. More importantly, discuss it from a spiritual, psychological perspective, which I believe is the key thing that's lacking in Hebrew school today, among other things. But the key thing is personal relevance. That all these ideas that go back so many thousands of years, biblical texts and commentaries and traditions and history that the Jewish people are rich with, often today in our day and age lack relevance, personal relevance. So they have the power of antiquity, which means you can't deny the fact they've been around almost before any civilization. People like Abraham, as I discussed last week, pioneered new approaches to life. But if you ask people, whether traditional Jews who've gone their entire lives to yeshiva, to schools, and who have a high-level Torah scholarship, people who are very devout, and ask them what is the personal relevance, what is the message in a particular episode or story, very few can answer that in any adequate way, which is why we search for other answers. And this is true. Imagine, this is just even the minority, the small percentage of Jews who have a very intense Jewish education. If you go about the entire Jewish people, where, New York alone, 10%, 1 out of 10 children get a Jewish education. So you can imagine, without education, definitely not going to find any personal relevance. So I find that it's always important to define your challenge and to find the need. That the biggest need today is relevance, personal, spiritual, psychological relevance. And if a person does not have that in their lives, they will always be empty or searching somewhere to fill that vacuum. And we all need it because we are human beings, complex human beings with complex psyches, with an unconscious that is filled with memories and experiences and scars and wounds. And many of them we're not even aware of because they took place long before our memory, long before our minds were, when we were little children, still impressionable. So if you really try to analyze this small little creature called a human being, meaning you and me and you and I and every one of us, it could be a 5 or 6 foot frame that weighs 100 or 200 pounds or whatever it is. But despite its relatively small size in the scheme of the universe, within us is layers and layers of miles and miles. I could say thousands of. We can't quantify it in time and space, but how many layers of complexity do you carry? So, if you want an example of what I said earlier about energy beneath the surface, just look at yourself. What you see is not what you get. When someone looks at you or you look at somebody, you're not just, on the outside surface level there's a certain physical body language and size and proportions. But how much are you carrying in your, how much anxiety do you have? What kind of memories do you have? How many fears and inhibitions and insecurities do you struggle with? If you think of it from that perspective, and we're subjective, if you had to quantify it, if you had to put it in a pile and say, if you're able to measure it, how much, it's far beyond the size as we think of it, because it can consume your entire life. You can be busy even with important things, and certain thoughts continue to haunt you and control. How much real estate does it control in your mind? Whether you have grudges or you feel that you've been grievances, you've been hurt, the feelings of vengeance, of anger, of jealousy. The list goes on. Besides all the other stuff that we have to deal with in our lives, and especially when you get into the area of relationships you're in, and how many hours, man hours, do you spend consumed with relationships? Whether, as they say, you're in one, or you're in a bad one, or you're in a good one, or you're the way out, or you're the way in. Everybody's got there somewhere. Nobody's neutral about this. Even if you're not in any relationship, that too is a choice, or at least a life situation, which also has to affect you. So when you deal with the complexity of the psyche, so even though the brain itself is the size of your palm, but this little size of your palm is the enormity of its impact on a human being is impossible even to estimate. And as I said, this is only what we know consciously. Now, of course, therapists are making a killing based on this little concept, because the amount of hours that we need to express ourselves and communicate and break the silence and stuff like that. Like one person once told me humorously that they've been in therapy for 30 years, and he tells me that the first 10 years just took to break the silence. And said, how much did that cost? So he gave me a number to break the silence. Now, of course, it sounds humorous, but for a person who's struggling with it and is anguishing over it, obviously, it's a serious part of our lives. Now, I hope none of what I said here is relevant to anybody in this room, because you're all innocent like little children, seamless, peaceful, right? Eleanor, how's it there? And I can't even see you. And don't struggle, but you may have friends or you may know people that do struggle in this way, so you can use some of these ideas perhaps to share with them. Or as that famous story that goes with the Rebbe Marash, is one of the great Rebbes. So someone came to him and said, Rebbe, I have a friend who has a serious problem, and he's ashamed to come to speak to you, so he sent me the Rebbe looked at him and said to him, well, why did he have to expose himself to you? He could have come to me and say, I have a friend. So sometimes the way to address issues is, whether it's because of our discomforts or our whatever, the fear of exposure or our pride, which is part of who we are. The fact is that sometimes it's hard to acknowledge. So this is not group therapy, so don't be concerned. No one's going to be asked to say anything. I'm the one that will say everything. And even though I'm speaking about other people, you should know I'm speaking about myself. Okay, that's my point. So everything I just listed is really me. Because where else would I know? How would I know if it wasn't resonated within? But we're all part of one human condition. And I will say, one of the most powerful stories I always remains with me, it's with another Rebbe, a very interesting, powerful story if you talk about what empathy means and what a soul doctor is. Because to me, the ultimate rabbi or Rebbe is a soul doctor. Not a fundraiser, not an administrator, not a politician, but a soul doctor. So here's the story. And it happened with a man whose name was Rabbi Dov Ber. He was the son of the Rav Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the famous author of the Tanya. And the custom was, as it is, as it remained for all the generations was, as it was in the times of Moses. People would come for counsel to a great Rebbe, for soul doctoring, so to speak, for insight, for perspective. And this was like much more than therapy, let's put it that way. In Hasidic lingo, it's called yechidus. The Hebrew word yechidus means a private audience. Like a yachid in Hebrew means an individual or a private audience. So in Kabbalistic writings, there's the concept of yechidus as that there are 5 levels of the soul. I'm just giving an introduction to the story. There are 5 levels of the soul. The soul has 5 names, but really 5 dimensions. And briefly, they're nefesh, ruach, neshama, chaya, and yechidah. I'm not going to go through all of them right now, but I'll just, since I mentioned it, those of you that are not familiar with it, it refers to the 5 different dimensions of what we would call life. So there's, of course, if someone says, what does it mean to be alive? So a doctor, a scientist will give you a biological definition. Alive means your heart is beating, your mind is working, certain basic organs and basic vital organs are functioning, and that's called being alive. Now, of course, God forbid, that includes also somebody who may be a vegetable in the hospital. Maybe somebody who's in a coma. Maybe somebody who even is walking around, but they feel like they're dead, emotionally and so on. But medically, they're alive. So in Kabbalistic terminology, that's called nefesh, biological life. A second level is called ruach, which means spirit literally, but the idea is emotional life. Not just that you're biologically alive and surviving and existing, but you also have an emotional life. You're feeling things. Then there's a next level called neshama, which is intellectual life. You can have emotional, but not intellectual. And then there's the fourth level is chaya, which is called transcendent life, where you don't just have, you're not just functioning and feeling and thinking, but you're also searching, looking for some transcendence. And then finally, the fifth is called yechida. Yechida leyartecha, we say in Hashan during the Sukkot prayers. And yechida literally means oneness, unity. Yom Kippur is identified with yechida. Achaz b'shana, once a year. Yom Kippur, not incidentally or coincidentally, has 5 prayers. Because on Yechida, one day in the year, where we are able to access the 5th dimension of the soul. Whereas a regular average day, and a weekday, we pray 3 times, which is Nefesh, Ruach, and Neshama. On Shabbat and holidays, we have 4 prayers, a Musaf, which reaches the transcendent level, and on Yom Kippur, the 5th, one day a year. But that's really more tangential. I just wanted to say it as an introduction to why an audience, or a counseling session, so to speak, between a chassid and a rebbe was called yechidas. Yechidas meant private audience, but it also refers to yechida meeting yechida, 2 souls meeting on their most intimate possible level. And that's a very high level of communication. Most of us do not achieve it in our lifetime. You know, when now you talk about communicating with others, even though you have the 5 levels of the soul, as I just described, but nevertheless, doesn't mean you're accessing it. It doesn't even mean you're conscious of it. And even if you are, it doesn't mean you can communicate it with other people. All day, most of the day we're busy, most of us are really just functioning on the nefesh level, in business, for example. You know, unless you need it for some particular reason, you don't need to expose your emotional side of your soul, or your intellectual side, or definitely not your transcendent side. So we use the most bare minimum of our spirits, our faculties, which is functioning, interacting. That doesn't mean you don't invest your mind and your heart in your business or something like that, but it's really mostly to survive. It's mostly to make ends meet. And that just shows you the tragedy of how much energy we're putting in just to be surviving in this world. When I say surviving, it doesn't mean you can make millions of dollars and still be on a survival level, because that's where your energy is going, is functioning in a comfortable way in this material world. And how much time goes into developing the other 4 levels of the soul? That's why Yom Kippur is such a special day. So Yechidus was a special occasion where 2 people, one person would go into a Rebbe, like into Moshe Rabbeinu, and speak and bare their soul, and they're able to access and reach the Yechidah, the essence of the soul. So the story that I was going to say was this. So there was after one holiday season, different people came for the holidays. After the holidays came to, they made appointments to go see the Rebbe, and for a week after the holidays, the Rebbe would see people. Some spent 3 minutes, some spent 5, some 10 minutes, whatever was necessary. And people would go away with advice, with strength, with blessings that would last them the entire year. This was in Russia. So here goes the story. They were standing, of course, people coming to see this Rebbe that I mentioned, of Dov Ber that I mentioned, and things were going smoothly, relatively. And then at some point, one person left the room of the Rebbe. The Rebbe tells his assistant that I want to stop continuing. I want to pause, and I don't want to continue seeing anyone now for a little while. Which surprised the assistant somewhat, because the Rebbe usually just went through because people were waiting. But he clearly, either the Rebbe was tired or he needed something, he needed to do some other things, whatever it was. So fine, they thought it would last a little break, half hour. But anyway, it lasted all night, and the next day as well. And the assistant, the Gabbai, was listening to, and he hears from the room of the Rebbe, he hears a lot of sobbing. He hears that the Rebbe is crying very intensely. Obviously, he didn't go in to disturb, but he realized something was going on, and he didn't know what it was. So he told the people, look, I don't know how long it's going to be. The Rebbe has his whatever needs he has. And so people, of course, respectfully waited. And that was the story. Then at some point he resumed receiving audience, people, and everything after the whole season ended and people went back home. The assistant was by the Rebbe, and he asked him, or I don't know exactly how it was initiated, and the conversation came around this issue, why the Rebbe had to take that break. And here's what he told him. The Rebbe said to his assistant, when people come see me to discuss something that is very personal, and they ask me advice, sometimes extremely intimate matters, different issues, I can't give anybody advice unless I'm able to find a certain reflection of the same issue within my own soul. I'm not just dispensing advice because I know more than they do. I have to find what they're telling me within myself in some subtle way. And then when I look inside my own soul, my own psyche, and I can understand it and appreciate it and know a way to so-called help myself, I'm able to then advise them. There was an individual that came into me, and he shared with me something that was so shocking that for the life of me I could not find anywhere some type, even in the most subtle form, some example, even as a microcosm within my own soul. But I knew that everything is divine providence. He came to see me. There's no way that he came here and he came here to share something. It means that I must have it within me as well. So that's why I needed to take a break, and I went for a deep soul search until I found something that was reminiscent, and that's when I called him back and gave him his advice, and then I was able to resume. Now, the reason this story always touched me so deeply is because you look around this world, how many people do you know that you can go to and that have such empathy? There are people that have compassion, have rahmanis, they have mercy, they have empathy, and they care. Even that is not common. But hopefully everyone has one person like that in their lives. If they don't, that's of course quite sad, because I know some people that don't. Or maybe you do and you don't want to access them, or you don't even know that they really care about you as much as they really do. But the level of empathy of this story, that is completely not something that common at all. And that the sensitivity that this Rebbe had to understand this, it wasn't like someone demanded of him. He understood. If someone comes to me, it's not about me, the wise man on the pedestal, or the guy in the ivory tower that has it all figured out, I'm going to give solutions. It was like true Moses. Moses was the humblest man that walked on earth. Now we all know Moses is also the greatest man that walked on earth. So what, was he not aware of his own greatness? Now humility, you see, has nothing to do with awareness. In Hebrew there's a word called anov, and there's a word called shafel. Anov means a humble person. Shafel means a person of low self-esteem. They should never be confused. They're actually two different ends of the spectrum. They may look alike to an untrained eye. Like, if somebody defers, or somebody has restraint and is quiet, there can be quiet and restraint that coming from a person who has no self-esteem and they don't have the courage and the strength to say anything, they have no confidence. Or it could be coming from a person who has so much confidence and strength that he doesn't have to always say something. And he's actually making a choice not to. So to the untrained eye, it may look the same thing. They're both being quiet. So the difference is, a shuffle is somebody who simply does not believe in themselves. They don't know there are any qualities, and they constantly think that they're the worst possible person. They loathe themselves. I'm not going to get into the reasoning why. An anav, on the other hand, like Moses, anav, Mukol Adam, it says, is a person who knows all his way. He knew very well that God chose him. He knew that he took the Jews out of Egypt. He knew that he was chosen to go onto Mount Sinai. Not that he wanted the job, mind you, but he was quite aware of his position. And when it came to times, he stood up for his position. But he never thought it was about him. That's the key thing. He never thought it was his strengths. He always knew that not keiche ve'etzim yad, it wasn't his own. He wasn't a self-made man. It was God's strengths, and it was God that did the choosing, not him. And he said to himself, if someone else had been given the same blessings as I, they would have done better than I. That is humility. Now, the strength of such humility is another discussion. It's not really for the scope of this evening. But these are great people. These are people, not weak people. That to have such strength requires more strength than a person who thinks they're self-made. Even though one may look much more pompous. So in this context, that this Rebbe had that sensitivity and understood that I'm here on this earth to help somebody. Not just me to help them, but they're also here to help me. So when someone comes to him, he looks into his own soul to see where he finds something similar. That is an unbelievable level of empathy. It actually goes counter to the whole Freudian model of psychotherapy where there's almost a obsessive investment in detachment. And I'm not suggesting that a therapist should get attached. I mean, Freud talks about transference and countertransference. And those that are really sophisticated know about countertransference. It gets complicated. You start forgetting who you are. You know, the therapist becomes the client, and the client becomes the therapist, and vice versa. You know, how many levels of countertransference you want to know? It can get, as I said, quite thorny. So there is all those ideas, but trust me, and that's again not for this discussion here. If you look at Torah psychology, it's far more sophisticated in its understanding, because it's not that when someone came to this Rebbe or someone came to Moses, they suddenly empathy meant that they broke down boundaries. Moses knew his boundaries. He knew who he could help and who he could not help, and he'd help people help themselves. So this is just about a level of empathy where you forget boundaries, but at the same time is the ability to recognize that there is a profound a dialogue going on, and that when you want to heal another soul, you have to somewhat heal your own soul, because we're part of one entity. It's not just, you're the problem and I'm the solver. It's more complicated than that. As a matter of fact, it even says that the reason the students of the Arizal, this is written in the writings of the Arizal and his students, why the Arizal, Isaac Luria, the great mystic of the 16th century, who was a tzaddik by all counts, was a person who saw on Yom Kippur, he would say Al-Chet. Al-Chet is the vidu, what we say, that I don't like to use the word confession, because another religion has taken control of that word. But it's a form of accountability, let's put it this way. Accountability, acknowledging our faults and our iniquities. I'm avoiding the word sins and confession intentionally, as you can imagine, for many reasons. So his students wondered, why the Arizal, why a tzaddik? It's one thing the rest of us need to say we have plenty to be accountable for. But a tzaddik, a person who's a righteous person, who we know, people knew that did not sin in his lifetime, or even if he did at such subtle levels, definitely not those that are enumerated in what we say throughout Yom Kippur. Why would the Arizal and others say these prayers and beat their chest, which is the custom, lightly? So the answer, this is written in the writings of the Rabbi Chaim Vital, the student of the Arizal, that because all souls are connected, and especially a tzaddik soul like the Arizal has a part of every other soul within him. So there's no such thing as your problem is your problem and my problem is mine. If you have a problem, this person, we all have a problem. Because those that appreciate and understand, not as it is in our fragmented world, that all human beings are part of one larger organism, and they're all part of one we call Hashem Echad, one higher unity, then it's like all different organs in one body. Would you write off any part of your body, even one hair follicle or one cell? If you knew it was one body, even though there's 75 trillion cells in the body, I don't think, we know one mutant cell, God forbid, what kind of havoc it can wreak. So when it comes on that level, when you understand the unity of things, then every detail is part of the bigger picture. And the Arizal, therefore, Al-Chet that he was saying, not necessarily because he did it, but the human race did it, and therefore it affected him, and he was sensitive to that. Now I know we'll say, well, we have enough problems on my own before I start getting sensitive to other people's problems. But sometimes, Kol HaMispal Ba'ad Chavere Hu Nenet Chila, there's an expression. Those that pray for another person, it helps you in return. Because there is a dynamic of a connection between us. And this, even though is not the theme that we discussed, we advertised, where we announced will be the class, but you'll see in a moment that it's connected. So bottom line is this, that in exploring the inner psyche and soul of each of our lives, there's many, many layers and many, many levels. And the truth is, for any of us to be able to talk about it and to empathize with each other is because in some way we are connected. So yes, I've spoken to people in my life that have experiences that are completely out of the realm that I couldn't even imagine. There are things that I've heard that when I first heard them when I was a younger man, I couldn't even believe were true. I thought the person was exaggerating. But as time passed, sadly and tragically, I discovered in life that there are people who go through unbelievable horrors in life and horrible homes, and I'm talking about serious, serious abuse and so on. And God should protect them; no one should ever know of it. And as I spoke to people and came to realize how low and how ugly the human condition can become for some, you could either shy away and run the other direction and say it's not my problem, where you come to realize that this is the problem of all of us. And especially when you're familiar with the Kabbalistic and Hasidic teachings, that the ability that people can hurt each other is such
this type of horrendous way that I'm not even describing examples, I don't even want to go here, is because there's a potential for it, is because we live in an existence where God can feel His presence. And we don't feel that underlying need. So, as I said before, the example, you were found in this example, that all parts of one organism. Is it conceivable that a right hand will hit a left hand if it did something wrong if you knew it was the same body? No. As a matter of fact, it's an autoimmune disease. The body rejects part of itself. It's one of the worst things possible. So, if we imagine if we all knew we were part of one large organism, that is not usual method.
So imagine if the human race, each of us felt that way, what kind of world we'd be in. I mean, it's a fantasy. But you think about it, it's not really a fantasy, because you have an example of it right now, from your own flesh, your body works that way. But as soon as it gets outside of your body and there are other people, obviously we don't see it and we don't feel it. But there are those few individuals, like that Rizal and like Moshe and like that Rebbe that I mentioned, that feel such soul connections. So when people speak to them, it's not about you and me. We're all part of one thing. Each of us touches another aspect of the bigger reality. That's what it comes down to. It's like different musical notes in one large composition. So if a musical note came to speak to you, even though it's not sitting right on the same line and the same verse as your note, but you know it's part of your composition, then it's part of your perfection as well. And we all need each other in that fashion. Now, think of this as a little, somewhat of an introduction to the theme I want to discuss, which it goes directly to a verse in this week's chapter, which those of you, if you read the email description of the class, just for my own information, how many of you actually read it? Okay, good. How many of you How many of you are here because you read it? That's even a better question. Don't have to answer that. Yeah? Okay. So good. I mean, I just need to know, right? When I write these things, it's good to know if it has any benefit. Sometimes, when you write and you teach, especially in this world of technology, sometimes people come over to me and they meet me for the first time, and they're like talking to me like they're my best friend, as if they know everything about me. And they do. They know my names of my children and my father and my this one and that one. And then I realize, of course, that they've been listening either online or CDs or reading. And it's always very awkward in a way because it's not equal. They know a lot more about me than I know about that person. So this, once upon a time when we didn't have technology, if I met you, you met me, and that was it. Today you can meet somebody and not vice versa, so to speak. Okay, it's part of it, and I guess it has its own virtues. It would be great if I was able. You could reach many more people this way, but it would be great also to. And one day we'll be able to have a two-way conversation, but then of course anonymity comes into play. Some people would not come out of their shell if they had to announce themselves. Well, I don't have that luxury, so here I am, and I have to find more sophisticated methods to hide conceal my inner feeling. So we'll work on that. So in this week's chapter. As I said, I described it in the email. There's a verse. It's actually the famous story that everybody knows. Well, at least it's not the most famous biblical story, but it's quite famous, and it still goes down today. We don't use the word Sodom as the most cruel city. So in this case, it was a twin cities called Sodom and Gomorrah. So this chapter talks about how this cruel and wicked city finally comes to the point where they will be destroyed. And it actually begins earlier when the angels, who Abraham didn't know they were angels, but came to visit him, and one of them brought the message that God is going to destroy the city of Sodom. Now, Abraham, it was relevant to Abraham because besides that It was relevant to him for the reasons I said earlier, as we'll see in a few minutes. Also, he had his nephew there. But it wasn't just that. As you see from the story, God says, will I conceal the fact that I'm going to destroy the city from my beloved Abraham? There's an actual verse that says that God considers concealing the fact. And we're actually told that God considered that. And God says, no, I won't conceal it. And that's when he tells him that he's going to destroy the city. Now, what does Abraham do as a reaction? He goes and prays. He prays for these infidels, which has many lessons of its own, of Abraham's attitude. But you see, like I said earlier with the Rebbes and Moshe, true great people don't just pray for themselves. They don't just protect themselves. There's an expression called a tzaddik in pelts. You know, pelts is a very thick fur coat. So a tzaddik in pelts means a righteous person who protects himself with a very thick fur coat. So if it's cold outside, he makes sure he's warm. But it's considered not to be exactly a compliment. When you say a tzaddik in pelts, it means somebody that just takes care of themselves and no one else. What's the contrast? The contrast is somebody who lights a fireplace, which makes not only him warm, but everyone in the room becomes warm. So not to be a tzaddik in pelts, meaning don't just warm yourself, warm everyone, and you'll also be warm. But there's a thing called being selfish. Even in the spiritual realm, religious realm, people can be very selfish. Abraham was not in that category. Abraham heard that Sodom was going to be destroyed. So you would think a man of faith, he should have been delighted. Finally, he's being vindicated. He's a man of virtue, and we always say the wicked prosper, and the righteous suffer. Finally, the wicked won't be prospering. He should have been, as I said, celebrating. Not only does he not celebrate, he actually goes and challenges God. And says, you cannot destroy the city because maybe there are 50 tzaddikim, righteous people here. And it's a whole dialogue back and forth, back and forth. I discussed this actually years ago also. On our website I have a few articles I wrote about it if you want to know more about this aspect of the story. That's not what I want to touch upon. I'm just sharing the context. And bottom line is, Abraham is not even able to find one righteous person in Sodom, so he fails. But all this is documented, mind you. You know, you'd think, if Abraham failed, why do we have to know the story? You know, it didn't work out, that was it. No, but we're told that God first didn't want to tell him about the destruction. Then he chooses to tell him. Then Abraham prays, and his prayers are futile, they're to no avail. We're told all of this, so obviously all of it is necessary to understand the story. Not just the conclusion, the destruction. How we should behave when we hear there are other people who are maybe living in a cruel city. Do we just walk away, or do we do something about it? I mean, there are many lessons. But the verse I want to touch upon, which happens to be a verse that is volumes, literally, volumes and volumes have been written about it in Kabbalistic and primarily Hasidic discourses, is when it comes to the words, and I'm just going to, let's find those words, where God finally decides to destroy the city. And this is how it's expressed. There's the verse. Okay. For those that are taking notes, it's 18:21, Genesis. So it goes like this: that after God says, "I will reveal it to Abraham." I'm sorry. So then it says, God says, I hear a great outcry coming from the city of Sodom and Amorah. Their sins are very grave. And the outcry, as the commentaries explain, was from the victims. It was a city that was a depraved city, complete criminal, sexual depravity and other forms that were a complete corrupt city. And of course the cries came out from this city. There's actually a story told about how they were especially brutal and how they tortured and they hurt people. You can read that on your own. I don't need to give you any nightmares. So then this next verse goes like this: I will descend, God says, and I will see for myself the cry, and see if it is correct or it's not correct, and if I have to do something about it. So the big question is asked, a philosophical question: what does this mean? Where was God beforehand? What do you mean he has to descend? Did he hear the cry or didn't he hear the cry? And we're not talking about a human being. That like maybe you're upstairs and you hear a cry, you want to go check it out and see if it's actually, so you go downstairs. What does it mean that God descends to check it out? It said a verse earlier that he heard it. That's why he said. So what is this erdana? I will descend. And of course it touches upon the biggest and most important question of all, which is much more than philosophical, very personal. Does God hear our cries? Now, of course, to compound and appreciate the question and the ultimate answer, let me amplify the question. There are philosophers and thinkers that argue that if you talk about a God in his supremacy as a creator is infinitely distant from any creature. And I use specifically the word infinitely. What does infinitely mean? As we know in the set of numbers, 1 and the greatest number, trillion, whatever the highest number you can figure, are equally distant from the infinite set of numbers. In other words, as you travel up the numbers, you don't get closer to infinity. The set of infinity mathematically is completely different quality than the set of finite numbers, no matter how large they are. Because remember, even trillion, zillion, whatever, what was there after a zillion? Google. It's an infinite number. And no matter how many numbers you go, they're all made up of units. So a trillion is a trillion individuals. Yes, it's beyond a single, but it's still in the same league. So using this example, if God therefore is infinitely distant from anything created, what relationship can they really have? Why would a God of such exalted character care about the cry of a mortal human being? And philosophically it's a dilemma. Because it would be, do you care about a speck of sand on the beach? And here we are talking about you and I, mortal human beings, and we're dependent on nature, even on a speck of sand. We're dependent on things we don't see in the ecosphere, in the entire environment. We're all interdependent, and yet, you can't. How could you focus? How much the last time you gave thought about an ant, or how many microbes you kill when you step off the bed in the morning, or when we take a shower? We don't think about it. So you could say, okay, we don't think about it because we're insensitive and we're selfish. But it's not just that. It's because we have a lot of other important things to do. And it's not even out of insensitivity. It's about focusing on priorities. Even for the healthiest person, you can't just focus on the things that are seemingly trivial. So from a philosophical point of view, what does it mean that God altogether cares about or knows or is aware of what's going on in this universe? And especially if you take into account there are many other universes, very large existence is quite a load. And then as I go back to the emotional and psychological question of, as I said, of course, is our own personal question about, does God hear our cries? And I don't have to probably repeat or acknowledge something that we all deal with in our loneliness. One of the harshest things, the most difficult thing to deal with when you're in pain, or you're agonizing, or in any other thing that's causing you anguish, is loneliness, the loneliness of it all. As a matter of fact, when Jeremiah, the prophet, Yirmiyahu, laments over the destruction of the temple, in the book called Eicha, Lamentations, which we say on Tisha B'Av, the saddest day of the Jewish calendar. So he begins, Eicha Yoshva Bodod. Eicha means in English, woe, or how terrible. Eicha. Yoshva Bodod. Look how woe to her that she sits all alone. In Hebrew, Yoshva Bodod, she sits alone. So of all the things that Yirmiyahu chose to open up the tragedy of the destruction, was not that the Holy Temple was destroyed, which itself was unbelievable desecration. The Holy of Holies, God's name. Not that fact that so many thousands of who knows how many people were killed during the destruction. Not the fact that the Jews would be exiled from there on until this day, from Jerusalem and from Israel, and all the consequences that would lead to. All that is mentioned later, but the opening verse is about the loneliness. Look, woe unto her that she sits alone. The her refers to Jerusalem. You can refer to the people, but that does regardless. But loneliness is what bothers. And the reason is very obvious and very simple. when you're in suffering, and when you're, God forbid, anybody's in a situation where you feel hurt, I submit that if you knew there was someone there with you and it wasn't so lonely, it would be easier to cope with. The big secondary effect of any painful situation is that you feel all alone, that nobody can relate to you, even people who care about you. They can relate to you when things are going well. They can relate to you on certain levels, but all the way in that lonely inner place, that you're all alone when you walk home alone, and your sorrow is your own and no one else can enter there, that loneliness in many ways is worse than the problem itself. Because when you feel there's someone there with you, then at least two of us, we can fight. When I'm weak, you'll be strong for me. But when you don't have that type of sense, you feel alone, and that's what pain does. Above all things, it isolates us. It makes us feel isolated. Doesn't mean we actually isolate, it makes us feel that way. So this question then, are we alone? And this is the question that people ask very often who are suffering. They say, why is God not hearing my cries? Where is God when I need him most? Now, it doesn't mean I can give a person an answer when they're in that type of emotional place. But in a strange way, that's when they need God most, obviously, is when they feel that way. So, the question, therefore, this whole issue of God hearing our cries and God has to descend, had many, many ramifications, and that's what I would like to address. So, as I said, the Kabbalistic and Hasidic discourses discuss this concept, God's descent. What does it mean? So first thing I have to begin as a small preface, this called the anthropomorphic principle, which actually means that you cannot apply anthropomorphic principles. Anthropomorphism would mean that you apply human dimensions to God. So Torah dibra b'loshen b'nei adam. The Torah speaks in the language of a human being. It's metaphor. When it says God saw, God heard, God's eyes, God got angry, God descended, God went up. These are all examples, these are all simple metaphoric language for us to be able to relate to. But it doesn't mean God actually descended, because that would suggest that God is there and not here. And that's, besides heresies, also doesn't make any sense. The divine force, the divine reality is everywhere. And it's within everything that exists. So there's no reason and no need to descend from one place to the next. Humans, or things that occupy space, as we know, it's spatial, under spatial parameters, need to go from one place to the next. Things that do not occupy time and space don't have to travel that way. And yet then, so what does descend mean? What does it mean that God went, God heard, God descended in this context? So obviously, it's referring to it on a qualitative level. Not spatially, but conceptually. And just to give an example from our own selves. Let's say someone you love deeply comes to you in pain or need. They want to speak to you. But at that moment you're distracted. You're busy with something else. Even good things. I'm not getting out whether you should or should not give them your attention, but for whatever reason you're distracted. Maybe you're preoccupied with your own pain, with your own issues, or with your own joy. But then they shake you and they say, I need to speak to you. And then you begin to listen and you begin to apply yourself. And when you finally do completely, what happened here? You're sitting in the same room with them. They're sitting right across you. A moment before you were not there, so to speak, for them, and now you are there. What happened? So you can't say a physical movement happened, because you didn't move spaces. You didn't they say come home and you came home. You're right there with them. But conceptually speaking, qualitative speaking, there was a shift in your consciousness. Till now you were not aware of that person, or you're not aware of their issues, or aware that they need you, and now you are aware. So you can call that, I wouldn't call it necessarily a descent, but it is a form of descent that you have now descended to their space, to where they are. And to be even more specific about the word descend, think of it as a parent and a child. A child may stub his toe or her toe, or have another issue, which you as an adult know very well, it'll go away in a few minutes, but the child that moment needs you. And you'll bend down, and you'll lift the child. But it's not just physically bending down, you descend your consciousness, your awareness, of care, is now applied to that person. So when we use the word descend here in this context, it's not about a physical descent, it's about a type of relationship, which only compounds the question in a way. Because then the question is this: yes, okay, so we understand that God on his own doesn't need us, or God on his own is completely beyond us, and yet he created us. And here we read that God, in certain situations, will descend, which means He will make Himself part of our existence. He will choose to apply Himself to us. So it's like in a relationship context. When people say, I feel you're distant from me, emotionally, you don't mean physical distance. You feel that even though they're right near you, that you don't feel they're there for you. So distance doesn't necessarily imply, actually, frankly, physical distance is not even close to the pain of spiritual or emotional distance. Because there are people who could be thousands of miles away and they love each other and they speak to each other, or they just, that person is there with you. So yes, it's the only pain is you don't see them and you miss them. But they're there for you, and that in a second's notice they would do anything for you. What about a person who sits right near you or spends his time all time with you and they're never there for you? That's far more distant. So the reason I'm elaborating is because the Torah really, for us to really appreciate these ideas, it's critical to go out of our regular mindsets, because we don't think like this. We usually think, we say someone distant, physical distance. Our natural tools that we gravitate to are always material and physical ones. But there's no way that you can really experience your soul if you're going to use physical tools. Because if you do that, bottom line, you could say, I don't even know if there's a soul because I can't see it, not under a microscope and not with binoculars and not with telescopes. The answer is, well, there's certain things you don't see with instruments. You have to use different instruments. You also don't see love. So how do I know that you love me? Well, if you open up your heart in a loving way, love understands love. Yes, if you think you're going to capture love in a basket or you're going to capture it in a photograph, it doesn't work that way. So it's all about the tools we use. So very much of this discussion, for us to be able to really ask the question, does God care? Does God feel us? Can we have a relationship with the divine and so on? Is the most important thing is to discuss our tools. If you are limited, if your tools limit you, you will not be able to access certain things. It's just like you're not going to access a deep well under the ground by just using your fingernails and trying to dig it up. You need serious tools to dig deep, to finally discover the water from underground. Dig a well. It's all about tools. And if you want to know, most mistakes most of us make is not about our goals, not about aspirations. It's about the tools. We underestimate, or we don't understand what kind of tools you need to what you're gaining. So many people say, I know exactly what I want. And they may even know what they want. Where the mistake is they don't know what tools you need to get there. So it's not just knowing what your objectives are. Everyone has objectives in life. It's also matching the objectives with the tools you're using. So if someone says, I'd love to reach these and these vistas and climb to great spiritual heights, what tools are you using? And often we don't look at our tools, because our tools themselves, we deceive ourselves into thinking, hey, I think I've got the tools. And sometimes your dreams blind you from seeing that 1 second. Are you realistic? That can you actually achieve that? I'll just give you an example, just to drive the point home, and then I'll go back to this theme here. After my book was published, Torah Meaning for Life, so as an author and a published author by a major publisher, so I became the stop for many aspiring authors to get advice. How do you get published? And that's when I discovered that in this country called America, where there's 300 million people, there are around 300 million aspiring authors. Except, of course, the children that are not yet, let's put it this way, their egos have not developed, or they're not yet aware of their talents to that extent. Now, I didn't meet the 300 million, but I met enough to see that the statistics are pretty much, everybody's got a book inside of them. Now, some people know they're not going to write it. They're someone else. They're just not writers. They're not communicators. Some people don't want to communicate. Some people would prefer not, their story is not told, actually, which, of course, makes the story even more interesting. So I became a type of advisor, and anyone I was able to help, I did. And I can tell you, this is now 15 years. Of the hundreds and hundreds of people that I advised, not one ended up getting published. So you think the problem is with me. They should go to a different advisor. No, I know they went to others as well. Now, I'm not afraid of looking at myself. Maybe I am the problem, but it was not me. And I realized the reason why, because they could not come to the terms of what tools you need to write a book. They may have had the story, and everybody thinks they have the most important story. I'm not going to get into the issues whether it's true or not. But the tools necessary, that was what nobody was able to climb that hill. And I saw it vividly, because I saw where they got stuck in writing a proposal. Like, basically, just to give you a quick summary, proposal, a book proposal, which is, besides the fact that you're not going to get a deal with any publisher or agent without one, is also good for you to focus and determine, it's like a business plan. So a book proposal, you need to write, number one is, what need does this book fill? The second is, who's your target audience? Now, you think those are simple questions. Trust me, out of 95% of the people I've spoken to, and this is not scientific statistics, that was the gate that nobody could go through, the first two. Forget about the other two is credentials and the structure of the book. The need, the first react, most novices have, everybody needs this book. And therefore the target audience is everybody. As we all know, everybody is nobody. So, what it means everybody, so I say, 1 second, everybody. You mean let's say 7-year-old children? Oh, no, not 7-year-old. I said, well, the 7-year-old children from, let's say, 7 to 12 is only 1 million, maybe a few million in America. So it's a big number. There are children's books. That's not for them. What about people over 90 who can't read because they whatever? Okay, not for them either. So I said, so let's narrow that age group. Let's start with that. And as you start narrowing, people don't think. Now, of course, a business person thinks like that. What's the need? But when you have a book inside of you, you're not really thinking business-like. You're thinking, I have something to express, and who is not going to be interested in my story? And then I always suggest to people, go to a bookstore and look for the shelf where you want your book to sit. Trust me, that's a humbling experience that very few want to do. Because they start thinking, 1 second, I'd like my book on all the shelves. But it doesn't work that way. They're not going to put your book on all the shelves in every category. So you have to choose. And once you choose, you start looking on the shelf, you see books that are similar to the one you wrote. And then you start looking on second. So how does yours stand out exactly? And I'm not saying this for a reason to dissuade anyone, but you have to really have courage, which is one of the big tools, and above all, humility. Humility to know that you don't know. So one person finally came back to me just recently. He said to me, I'll tell you what I learned from your advice. And I didn't accept it initially. I now don't know what I don't know. I realize that. So now in the rest of my life, I'm going to try to figure out to know that I don't know. At this stage, he doesn't even know what he doesn't know. Okay? So that's progress. You can write a book about that. Anyway, all this I'm saying is really relevant only for one reason, about tools. Don't ever underestimate or overestimate your tools. Because I would always say, err always on the side that you have less tools than you think you have. And I don't mean it in a way of knocking yourself. Because we're extremely subjective. We do not understand the tools we have. Because, for example, if I said to you, what do you see on that wall? Everybody trusts their eyes, and they say, I see a beige wall and windows. Now, there's no reason to deny that you're seeing that. I agree. I also see the same thing. But that's how confident you are in the tool called seeing, which is why magicians, the sleight of hand, can deceive you, because they get beyond. They know how to manipulate your tools against you. So it's innocuous and innocent when they talk about the wall. But then you may see things that your eyes tell you see something, but it's really not what you think you're seeing. That's with eyesight, or what people tell you, what they promise you. The naivete, we want to believe. You don't want confrontation. How many of subjective factors come into play in decisions that have nothing to do with objective reality? Now, in many situations, it's pretty innocent, and the worst is, okay, you made a mistake. But there are areas in life where this is life and death. You can make a major mistake. You can make a mistake that's almost irreversible. So one of the critical things in really exploring and understanding yourself is you have to look at what tools you use. And I can tell you from my own experience, when you first start thinking in terms of how do I understand descending, not in a spatial, physical way, it's very disconcerting because we like to think in terms of physical. When I was in yeshiva, the big joke was that whenever we asked a teacher a question, the good teachers would say to us, well, they'd say something, and they say, well, it's a contradiction. We would tell them it's a contradiction of what it says in another place. They say, es wenn sich wundert in Yiddish. It means, it depends on what level you're talking. And this became the joke that the teacher would always tell us, it depends what level you're talking, which we saw as being very dismissive and very yeah, okay, that way no contradictions, because everything depends on what level you're talking. You get a little older, and you come to realize that's the brilliant answer, because life is not black and white. Little children don't understand that. Children don't think in abstract terms. When you get a little older, you realize the power of nuance. That it's case by case. Different situations require different solutions. But our simplistic minds always want to have a black and white, this is the answer, yes or no. When you begin to appreciate that many things don't have a yes or no, and that doesn't mean there's a maybe. It means the truth of the matter is that there are more factors than just black and white, good and evil. Then you begin to really appreciate the nuances of life, and life is much more complicated than that. That doesn't mean there aren't absolutes. But most of life is not about absolutes, especially in human interaction. But our minds are looking for quick answers and so on. So to go back now to God's relationship with us, yes, I can go into a whole description and discussion of how that relationship works. But the first thing is we have to get rid of assumptions and axioms, which are also part of our tool chest. Because there are assumptions, we have assumptions. Like the assumption that those philosophers have, that God is too great to have a relationship with us, what is that based on? If you really think about it, how do they know that? Well, it's based on yourself. If you think you're a big philosopher and superior to inferior people, you think, okay, God, who's the God of it all, must be infinitely arrogant, as I am. I mean, not that God is arrogant, but infinitely detached. Because I'm so detached. That's where they get the point of reference. Where else do you know it from? But did God tell you that He's so detached? Or you came to a logical conclusion that God created it all. He must be completely... But then there's one small little thing. Why would He create things that are insignificant to Him? Why would He create a universe and then say, I'm not here, I'm detached? So that already is an area a philosopher can't answer because it has no clue why. The truth is, if you really think of it from a philosophical point of view, God should never have created this universe. He should have created other gods that are similar to God that can compete with Him. Why we create mortals that die and erode and all the flaws that we have? It doesn't seem like that doesn't seem like a relationship. You know, if I wanted to create a relationship, I'd look for someone that's like an equal. Maybe not exactly equal. You make sure you dominate a bit, but you know what I mean. In the ballpark, like they say, there's an expression in one of the books that says, you can't have. Actually, I think who's the author of Lord of the Flies? No, not Tolkien didn't write Lord of the Flies. No, Tolkien is what? Sorry? Doesn't matter who the author is, but where did he get the title from? So the book has a reference to the epileptic there that has that visions about the flies and But Lord of the Flies is actually an expression in some books, in Holy Torah books, that says you can't have a lord over flies. You can't be a lord over flies. A king, let's say a human king, will not feel being a king if he's a king over flies. It's a little, you wouldn't call yourself a king. I mean, maybe some people would feel good for a moment, feeling at least I'm a king for one day. All the flies listen to me. In other words, when you're a leader, the people you lead have to have some type of common denominator, or else there's no relationship. So you may be the leader. You know, we always have that. What do we call it? The Jewish IQ quiz. The question that's asked is: the king of the fools, is he a bigger fool than the fools, or is he a greater, or is he a smaller fool than all the other fools? You can debate that all night, and it's one of those that don't have an answer, just for the record. So don't feel bad if you don't find an answer, because it depends what you're talking about. You can argue the king's the king of the fools; he must be smarter than all of them. That's why he got himself to be king. Or you could say, well, since they're all fools, obviously the biggest fool is going to be the king of the fools. Is there enough community? Is there a difference between the two answers? I don't know. So I don't know if it's spend your energy on this one. So to go back to God and the relationship, what the Kabbalists explain is the following: that we cannot apply to God anthropomorphic concepts of greatness. In the human world, an elitist is a person who doesn't want to mix with people who he thinks are not in his class. Because in human terms, we all decide what we think is superior, what we think is special. When it comes to God, we have no right to apply such a rule. Because remember, and this is a key thing in Kabbalistic teaching, is that the rules were created by God. So therefore they cannot be applied to God. God could have written different rules. So the one who creates or writes the rules is not subject to those rules. And therefore, to make the statement that God is too far or too distant from us to care about the cry of a little child when there's 6 billion people on the planet, and there are trillions and trillions of creatures in all the universes and solar systems, is simply a wrong assumption. It's an assumption based on human logic. The human logic, you and I could not think about 6 billion people at once and hear all their cries. Because we think infinity doesn't care about the finite. But what about this? Maybe God isn't infinite. Maybe God is beyond infinite. Maybe infinite itself is a definition that limits God. These are not my words. Ibn Gabbai, in a great book that in the Middle Ages wrote, Vayeira, he writes the following. And this becomes the basis of the answer to this question, Erdana. He writes, I'll say it in Hebrew first and then I'll translate. That God is kol yachol, meaning He's capable of all, omnipotent and so on. And kishem sheyesh lekeche bebilti bal gvul kach yesh lekeche begvul. Anybody got that? Just as He has the power to create the infinite, He has the power to create the finite. Because if you say He can only create one and not the other, it means that itself makes Him finite. So here's the twist of logic, which ultimately comes down to the paradox. To say that God is infinite and not finite is just as equal as saying God is finite and not infinite, because you're saying He's this and not that. The definition of finite doesn't mean that it's finite and not infinite. It means it's this and not that. As soon as you limit something, you're already limiting it. So in a strange way, the infinite set of numbers, though they're equally distant from every finite number, but they themselves are also a category called the set of infinity, and therefore have their own parameters and their own rules. So therefore, when you talk about God, God is neither finite or infinite, and therefore you cannot apply this rule that the small little things don't matter that much. Only for great things that are defined by their greatness does something small not matter. However, it requires a process. And this is where Kabbalah comes and explains the bridge, called the cosmic bridge, a cosmic order. It's called Seder Shtalshlus, where God essentially created a system of building blocks that allow an existence of God that is so beyond anything we can imagine, have a relationship with us. And that's exactly why God created it. So to go and apply our logic that it's so distant is not at all accurate. There is a true relationship, but that relationship has to be built by us, and it has to be like a bridge. We have to climb it. We have to climb the ladder and do so in a step-by-step way. So what this verse is saying is the following. There's a dimension in the divine that is beyond existence. And that dimension, yes, can be detached. And though it may hear a cry or two, it remains detached because it's beyond it all. But there's a deeper dimension of the divine that cares. And for God to, so to speak, manifest on that level, requires a certain descent. The descent is that God has to in some way manifest in an order that has a relationship with us. Now here may not be again the place to go into this whole discussion, and I can refer you to certain places where I elaborate on it, but I will say that if you have my book Torah Meaningful Life, there's a chapter called Unity that discusses this in very palatable terms. And the example given, and this is really also a great example for relationships between us, between each other, is the following. Think of a teacher who has a brilliant mind and wants to convey and share those ideas with someone, with a student he cares about. So of course, being that the student is a beginner, you can't just expect the student to begin to understand it all. So the teacher has to in some way conceal and condense and contract his mind. If the teacher would just begin to say everything that's on his mind, it would overwhelm any student, especially a beginner. So the teacher does is conceals it all. Conceal in order to reveal is what we call it, which is really the art of true communication. Not to conceal just to conceal, not because you're hiding something, but it's the art of knowing how to transmit and spoon feed, so to speak. It's also the art of love, by the way. And by the way, because love is also transmission. That love doesn't just mean you're willing to love somebody or you care about them. Love also means that you're willing to understand that your parameters and the person, your beloved's parameters, may not be the same. So love is also the wisdom and restraint of knowing how much, how little, when you need space, when you need to be intimate and close, and when you need to be somewhat, I want to say distant, but apart. And that apart is not because of anger or because of bad feelings. Apart is because of respecting the space of individuals. Love is something we grow. Just like the teacher is not concealing and restraining ideas just to restrain, is because the student has to acclimate himself or herself, and as the containers of the student expand and begin to understand the first ideas and the metaphors, then you grow and you move from there to the next level, where you continue, the transmission continues to flow, the containers that receive the transmission continue to expand, and one day the teacher and the student can understand exactly what the teacher meant and reach brilliance and even beyond the teacher, the original teacher. This is an art. And it's really ultimately the best metaphor used in how we develop a relationship with God. So when Moses said to God, show me your face, show me your glory, Moses wanted to be able to have a relationship with God face to face. And God said, you're not ready for that yet. You cannot see me and live. I've discussed last week in other classes about what that means. The point I'm trying to make is that the goal is, yes, we can ultimately see and become one and connected to the divine itself. Because remember what the Bible says. Each human being was created in the divine image. We have a little God inside of us. And God has a little human inside of God, so to speak. Because we're all part of one entity. Obviously, one is God and one is the creator, one is the creature. But it's a relationship and a partnership. And the exhilarating and the beautiful part of it is that it's up to us to build this relationship. That's why we have prayer. That's why we can have chutzpah. That's why we can have a dialogue with God. The myth that God is the giver and we're the receivers, which is a truth to that God, of course, blesses. But the myth that it's a one-way street, that God is the one that's doing all the giving and we're doing all the taking or receiving, is not true. The expression is we're a partnership. God provides the resources, the blessings, but we develop them. And like in any business, the one who provides is like the one who provides the cash, the other one provides the service. So it's a partnership. And this partnership is an equal partnership, and God, that's exactly what God chose. Now it's another discussion, what does that mean, equal, if God chose it? And it's more complicated, obviously, than what I'm saying right now. But as far as the context of our discussion here, that's what the verse is coming to say. That absolutely God hears our cries. And it's critical that we know that. That's why it's expressed. You could have said, why does God say God had to descend? Could have said, God heard the cries and did what he had to do to Sodom. That's not the point of God, because it's important for us to know that there are different dimensions. There's God as he is, so to speak, in the Godhead, separate and detached from our reality. And then when a person cries, you can access God and have God come to you. So it requires effort. And it requires, as I said, it's a two-way street. And this, even though it may sound like, when I'm in pain, why doesn't just God, if he really cares about me, just come and save me? You may think that would be the greatest gift. It would not be. It would be an equal gift as if a mother sees a child fall and say, you know what, I don't want my child falling, so I'm not going to let my child walk because they can fall. There's no such thing. Every child is going to have to fall once or twice or 3 times or more. And I don't just mean it physically, that's in the beginning stages. Psychologically and emotionally in life, a healthy parent knows that as a child grows, there's going to be the different stages. Many times you have to cut the umbilical cord, and you have to let your child make his or her mistakes. It's not easy for a parent to see, and obviously if you can prevent it, great, but to prevent it at the expense of compromising the independence of the child, at whatever age, that is much worse than the mistake. Because then you clip their wings. And many people in the name of love and care and concern have hurt very deeply their children. And people, it's not just children, it can be also adults. In the name of love, we can hurt each other with good intentions. Besides the fact maybe it's your insecurity, not really, and you're projecting it upon your child or upon the person you love. But even if it wasn't, every person have to go at their pace. Now, it needs wisdom to determine when you intervene, when you don't. This does not mean if you see a child, God forbid, a little child crossing the street, you don't say, let them learn from their mistakes. God forbid. But there are situations, everything has to be measured. But if a child's at home and you see a child standing up for the first time, and they fall, and they cry even, what you do is, you say, I'm here for you, but come. You stay a few feet away, you make sure the child has the confidence, knowing that you're there to pick them up when necessary. But you intentionally don't touch them. So that type of dance, so to speak, is similar to what I described earlier, how a teacher transmits information. You conceal while you reveal, and you reveal while you conceal. You're doing it all in the way to allow a person the dignity of being able to make choices. So yes, it would have been very appealing, and what's the word I want to use? Appealing is good enough. For God to say, my children are hurting, and I have to come and intervene. But that would undermine ultimately who we are. Now you could say, why does God have sometimes more compassion than others? Again, these are some mysteries that I don't have answers for. But it's a relationship, and God says, yes, I do have to descend. And for me to descend, I need you to cry out. Now crying out, remember, is not just about making you feel bad and cry. It means you're making an effort. It means you're aware that there's a problem. What about all of us that go into such denial? And our pride and our toughness is so strong we don't even want to cry. So where is God then? God says, oh, you're not even open to cry? You can't even open yourself up like that? So what do you want me to do? How can I enter? You don't want to acknowledge that you need to cry. So the idea of breaking silence, of crying, should not be underestimated. It is itself a call. Why did God create us with the ability to cry? The same reason God created us with the ability to feel pain. You'd say, why do we need to feel pain? Well, if you didn't feel pain, you wouldn't have a warning that there's a problem. God forbid someone's nerves are severed and they don't feel pain. It's not exactly a blessing. That's why that doctor was so excited when he saw the stroke patient who, after months and months, wasn't feeling anything, suddenly started yelling, why are you pricking me with a pin? And the doctor kept laughing. He said, because you haven't been feeling it for 4 months, So now you're feeling it, we're in good shape. Now obviously then the intention is not to cause pain. But the idea is that we are in a world where we are given signals. If a person did not have the ability to cry, you know what it would be like? It would be like a kettle. A boiling kettle with boiling hot water that has no spout. You know what happens? So with a kettle it explodes. And with a human being, it's what we call, it implodes. A person that does not have the release of tears, and I mean tears, I don't just mean actual crying, it means also expression, some way to be able to say, I need something, I'm in pain, I need help, or whatever it is. That is a spout. It's like saying there's a problem and I need to release. And people who don't know how to do that, or I've experienced also people who've been told by their abusive parents, you don't cry in this house, only babies cry. I remember meeting a guy, told me, after we talked, I saw how much pain he was in. And I asked him, when's the last time you cried? He said to me, 40 years ago. And he remembers his father telling him, only babies cry, you never cry in this house again. Which in many ways was even worse than the reason he cried. Because that means you're not even given the validation. That maybe, validation. That's why they say the silence is worse than the rape. Because then you don't even have the validation, the dignity to say, I was hurt, I was violated, I'm in pain. So though nobody likes to be in pain and nobody likes to cry out, but when you're in a situation like that, it's better to do it than not to, because it doesn't go away. What happens is the body, as they say, body carries messages. The fact that our bodies become tense. It's like knots. And there's, even physically, people can feel it. Sometimes you touch somebody and they get stiff. Is because there's knots inside of them. And knots can be developed over years and years of restraining feelings, of withholding, of being tough. So on the outside you're very tough, but on the inside, the only way is through imploding. So God says, you cry and I descend. That's how relationships work. And in the Kabbalistic construct, as I said, of the cosmic order, they describe that this really refers to what's called the world of Atzilus. This is called the world where the divine manifests in, we call it a human structure. So we say, for example, in the prophecy of Ezekiel, he says that he sees K'dmus Mara Adam. He sees sitting on the throne. He sees like an image of a human being. Similar to what we read in the beginning of the Bible, Genesis, it says God created the human in divine image. What does a divine image look like exactly? Abraham Joshua Heschel would challenge his students in opening classes that he would say, where's the only place in the Torah where God defied his cardinal sin? And he would say, the second commandment says, do not create anything in the image of God. God defied that by creating a human being in the divine image. So that's a conundrum you could think about. But practically, however you interpret it, the fact is God says in the Bible more than once, Selam Aleichem. So the Kabbalists, which is really the only way to understand it, because you cannot apply human terms to God, use this verse to explain it, that this is how God descends. Because you could say, well, God is so infinitely distant, even infinite from infinite, which only makes him more distant. Yes, it's true that God, in his own infinite wisdom, is able to care about every detail, which is something hard for us to understand, how something so great, because we don't relate to something like that. As I said, for us it's inconceivable that one person can care about 6 billion people. Not because we're insensitive, because it's simply not possible. It's unfathomable. So you can say, okay, God is able to do that, but what's the process by which he does it that we can relate to? That's the challenge. So the Kabbalists lay out and say that this divine image is the first step. That's the erdonal. God descends and creates an image that has divine features. And you could say basically it's half divine and half human in a way. So obviously not physically speaking. It has divine elements. So for example, let's take the faculties of the human being. We have, you may be familiar with the 10 spheres. The 10 spheres, Chachma, Bina, Das, we have intellectual faculties, we have emotional faculties, love. So take the faculty called love. Does God love? So the immediate answer would be yeah. I mean, people say God loves us, fine. But if you think about it, 1 second, does God love? Does God love as humans love? Well, if God's not human, He doesn't have human love. So what does it mean that God loves? And you could go back to that philosophical quandary I mentioned earlier, that God is beyond love. Love is a human, or you could say human. Love is a created faculty. It's part of our existence, but it doesn't exist in the world of God, who's beyond it all. So the Kabbalists say, no, God descends into the level of love, which means that in order to create the universe, God said, love comes from within me. So though you could say God is not love, meaning, I'm sorry, you could say God is love, but you can't say love is God. It's like saying God occupies this entire space of existence, but existence doesn't equal God. So it means that love is a manifestation. Where does love come from? It originates from the divine power. So in a sense, there's a process where the divine stands in one place where there's no faculties, and then certain emanations emanate. One of them is called love. This is called emanation in Kabbalistic terms of the spheres. And in essence, is really the process of the descent, what it means to say that God descends. God emanates. And so God on his own is beyond love, beyond any faculty we can imagine. But at the same time, where does love come from if it's not from God? So you may say, well, what does that mean? How do you explain such a thing? Well, there are many explanations. You could have, for example, a body of water that has many, many features in it. Water has a chemical makeup, has a biological makeup, has microbes. You could say, for example, that every molecule of water, as we know, is H2O. So it's 2 points of oxygen for every point of hydrogen. I'm sorry, 2 points of hydrogen for every point of oxygen. So it's made up of these components. So even though we call it water, water can still have many emanations, many things that come out of it. Or a human being can convey an idea. I may share an idea here this evening, and from this idea, many other ideas can emanate. So the idea, the metaphor I'm using is to explain that God can be beyond it all, but then there's an emanation that turns into what we call the structure of existence. And this, mind you, is all before we actually were created. And then God said, I created a human being in that divine image. So in a sense, we're 2 steps away. God manifests and descends in an image that later becomes the template and the model for which we can relate to. So in the Kabbalistic structure of things, the way we develop the relationship is that we climb the steps, first from our lowest and the low end to the point of relating to the divine image, and then from there we move on to the next dimension. Now I know maybe this last few 10 minutes of discussion may have been over the heads of some of you, and maybe my transmission skills of revealing and concealing were not at perfection here. But on the other hand, there's also always a reason to always speak a little above people's heads as well, including my own. So in the spirit of being all one here, I may not have understood what I just said myself, so don't feel bad. I remember I wasn't there, but someone told me they were at a lecture and a guy was talking for 3 hours, and afterwards, and he said he was a pretty brilliant guy. The guy who told this to me, a scholar. So I said, so what did he say? He said, I don't understand a word. So I said, what happened? So he said, everybody was walking out. I said, did you understand what he said? No, it was so deep, nobody understood it. So we also have that. That's also a problem. And the question then is, maybe it was nothing. He was like the emperor with no clothes. If nobody understood it, then... So hopefully what I said, at least till now, before, that makes some sense. But the truth is, what I touched upon, the reason that it was maybe a little dense was because I didn't elaborate enough. But it's something that can be understood. And maybe I'll talk about it next week more at length. Because that we don't have all night here. Maybe I do. I don't know about you. I don't know your curfew. But the point I wanted to make is that it's critical to understand that to answer the question that God does hear our cries. but it's a complicated process. And it's very much connected to how we open up our own channels. Because as I going back to what I said earlier, you cannot have a relationship with God if it's only on your terms. You're going to have to expand your horizons. You have to refine your tools. But that doesn't mean you do all the work is on your end. It's a two-way street. So God descends and we ascend. And we meet halfway. And this, in essence, what I said to you is right now, is the essence of all mystical teaching. It's the process of how those two come together. How that so-called like the translator that bridges the two languages, the human language and the divine. And there is a place, and that's the place called Atzilus, where God descends, where God manifests in a structure that is very similar to our universe, but it is essentially, you can think of it as an archetype of our universe. It's the quintessential perfect form of what our existence is like. So think of it this way. God, before that descent, is beyond all these faculties, has it all within him, but they're not conscious or they're not manifest. Then God manifests in, let's say, a thing called love. But the way divine love looks is its perfect form. It's pristine, innocent, quintessential, as I mentioned. Then that love evolves further, ends up being a love that we experience in our material world, which is flawed, subjective, can be selfish. We see how love is. Love can be very beautiful. It can also be very ugly. It can be very destructive. And the objective in life is to use the template of the divine love, that middle ground, to help us align ourselves, the human love, into that divine love, which in turn connects us to God as he is beyond all those dimensions. So, more elaboration on this will require more discussion and more reading. If you want to pursue this, I highly suggest reading the chapter on unity and Torah Meaningful Life. That's one place. And if you email me, I'll be happy to send a few articles that I've actually written on this particular topic of how this process works. So I'm only laying the seed here, but we'll discuss this more, as I said, next week, in the coming weeks. But on a conclusive note, especially relevant to our personal lives, the key thing beyond the esoteric and the mystical and the dense stuff is really, in a sense, a simple message. And that is that God does care. However, if you lock yourself up in loneliness and don't let anybody in, including God, you're basically becoming your own worst enemy. So, as strange as it may sound, in the times that we feel most we want to be alone, is the time that you need actually to open up. Maybe not necessarily to another person who you may not want in your life at that point, but definitely to God. That's when we need it most. But it's the single hardest time because you feel so isolated. So this whole idea of God hearing our tears is, like, as I said, a two-way street. And it means that, yes, in the most darkest of moments, you can access the greatest of strengths. And this isn't just some theory. I have seen it in my own life. I've seen it in people's lives who have suffered greatly. Thank God I have not suffered greatly compared to others. But I've seen people who have tremendous losses, impossible even to imagine how they would ever bounce back. And time and again, you always hear the same thing from people like that. I had two choices. I could sink or swim. I'll give up or I dig deeper. And it always comes down to a deeper understanding, doesn't mean they have an answer, but some deeper access of energy that most people will say is inexplicable. They don't know where it came from. Just like Holocaust survivors rebuild their lives. Very hard to imagine, explain. But it means that there's something there. There's that classic greeting card or whatever it is about those two sets of footprints on the sand, which just reflect a person's whole life. And God is the second set of footprints walking along you. And then as the person looks and sees those segments in life when there was most pain and most suffering, they only see one set of footprints. So the person says to God, why, when I needed you most, were you not there? You walk alongside me in good times. What about the difficult times? So God's response is, well, in those times I was carrying you. Meaning the one set of footsteps is not yours, that's God's set, and you are being lifted. But you don't know it at the time, and you don't feel it. And this does not answer pain or suffering. That's not the discussion here, why things happen. It just says that when it does happen, we don't ask why, we ask what we can do about it. And what you can do about it, there's a deeper dimension. And that's really what God's message here is. Sodom was a cruel city. We live in a cruel world ourselves. And sometimes it's more cruel than others. There are many beautiful things, but there are times that we see really not beautiful things. And God is trying to give us a blueprint and tell us it's happened before, and I have a relationship, but it takes effort. Because for me, I have to come down there. And for you, you have to cry. And you have to reach. And then when we join, we can resolve things. And the fact is that now it's almost 4,000 years since this verse took place. And we're here to talk about it. So there must be something in this to think about. So I want to bless everybody. They should not have to ever rely on these type of strengths. And we should be able to get by without having to go there. But life, as we know, throws its curveballs. Everybody's got their challenges. So so the verse also, of course, applies even to those of us that are living very happy lives. That doesn't mean that we don't have a way to go in growing and connecting, as I said, to the divine image of things. Because no matter how beautiful your life may be, there are many greater horizons to conquer. And this one little verse tells us about that interface, the interface between the divine and the human. And on that note, I want to wish everybody a very good week. I want to also say this class is especially dedicated to a young boy named Binyamin Ben Mendel, who is actually undergoing, right, as we speak, right, an emergency surgery. So I guess this class dedicated to him while it's happening can only be a source of blessing. And so I think this theme that I just discussed definitely applies to this particular situation. Should be very well. And I will also say that Philip will not be giving his class tomorrow night, only tomorrow night. Next Thursday he will be. And I will continue in the class next Wednesday night. And those of you that are not getting the weekly emails, I send out a weekly email, so if you haven't left your email address, please do so. And I will be happy to send my weekly and any updates. And above all, just as I said, relationships, please see Meaningful Life Center, myself, all of us, as an interface as well, as a relationship, a give and take. And if in any way I could be of any help to anybody in their spiritual journey, please don't hesitate to ask. And if you're bashful, you can always say it's for a friend. And I hope we can call upon you in the same way. And may everybody have a great week, a good journey as we continue the journey, and look for those sparks, spiritual opportunities that are everywhere. And above all, even in sometimes the darkest moments, you have the greatest opportunities of all. So everyone have a very pleasant evening. Thank you so much.